All right, guys. So welcome to area of study 2, which is looking at Earth as a dynamic system. Earth is a system which is constantly changing, constantly fluctuating, and constantly moving. Okay, and we're looking at those fluctuations, at those changes to Earth, and that's what we're studying for the rest of this term. Okay, the changes to the Earth's system. Okay? So before we look at the changes to Earth systems, we need to look at Earth systems in a little bit of detail. Okay? And we already have done that through our area of study 1, but we just want to go into a little bit more detail on a couple of things. So area of study 2, Earth the dynamic system. And we started this unit by looking at what a systems approach meant, and we started this actually last term. So you have to think all the way back to when we looked at the parachuting cats of Borneo. And that example of how cats were parachuted in to fix the issue of the mosquitoes, but the mosquitoes were poisoned and that killed the lizards, and then the lizards were eaten by the cats, and then the cats died, and then that meant rats came back. And so there were all these different effects of killing mosquitoes, and because of this, it led to some crazy parachuting cats. And the point of that was just to say, look, everything in Earth is related. If you harm one thing, you harm everything. Yeah. If you help one thing, you help everything. And Earth is this interconnected system where everything is joined in a balance, and that's what we're looking at. Okay. And then we started to look at food webs and energy flow, but you might have forgotten that. So we're going to jump straight back into that today. We're going to look at what food webs are. We're going to look at energy in a system and how everything, again, is interconnected when we're talking about how animals eat and plants eat and how everything eats. After that, we're then going to look at short-term changes to the Earth's dynamic system. So looking at what changes happen daily, what changes happen monthly, what changes happen seasonally and yearly. Okay, or between different years, and that's all short term. It's all considered short term. Now, you might think a year's a long time, but not when we're talking about the Earth. Okay, the year is a very short amount of time. We're then going to focus on medium term changes, which happen over about hundreds of years. Okay, so things like succession, land cover changes, a bit of a typo there, and desertification. Now, if you don't know what those terms are, that's fine. We're going to discuss them in a lot of detail. And then we're going to go into long-term changes, with things that happen over thousands of years, and if not way longer. Things like thermohaline circulation, which you will learn about, and evolution, and some other cycles as well that we'll focus on. And then we'll end by looking at climate change. We'll end this unit almost end it by looking at climate change and what's happened long-term and what's happening at the moment, and whether that's still long term or maybe another fits into another category. And finally, we'll finish off with throughout the whole thing, we'll look at how we monitor different changes and how we know that things are changing. Okay, so let's jump into food chains and food webs. Okay, we started this last term, but we're going to really refresh on it. So energy flows through the ecosystem. It doesn't stay in one place, it moves, okay? And we use food chains to talk about the way that energy moves, okay? So energy is within our food, and we know that comes from carbon. We've talked about photosynthesis and carbon, how all energy on planet Earth originates from the sun, okay? And food chains are used to describe the feeding relationship between organisms in a community, which is just an area of living things. So we use a food chain. Now, the first law of thermodynamics. Now, if you don't know what that is, that's okay. It's a bit physicsy for this class, but the first law of thermodynamics is to do with heat and energy. And it states that energy is neither created nor destroyed. It's always there, but it just changes from one form to another. You might have heard that before. So the arrows on a food chain indicate the transfer of energy, where the energy is being transferred. Okay, so here's an example. You've got algae in a pond maybe, and this algae is photosynthetic. It is able to capture the energy from the sun, turn it into glucose, which has carbon in it, and is able to store it in its plant material, its algae material. And the tadpole feeds off this algae, and this this is a feeding relationship, and we represent with that arrow in the direction of the energy movement. So that arrow is moving towards the tadpole because the energy is moving towards the tadpole. And the small fish then eats the tadpole, and the energy moves into the small fish. It's the feeding relationship. Okay. Multiple food chains exist in all ecosystems, interlinking in a complex pattern. Okay, and these are food webs. Now, so food chains are not isolated; they mix and mold together, and we'll talk about why that's important in a second. Producers are at the base of the food web, and these are living things which can manufacture their own energy. They can take sunlight and turn it into sugars. Okay, this is plants, plankton, and chemo producers at the very bottom of the ocean can do this as well without using sun and actually use volcanic energy, which is pretty crazy. Most of them, though, do photosynthesis. Okay, and that's plants and phytoplankton. That's in the ocean. So they're producers. Next, we have first order primary consumers. Okay, first order consumers, primary consumers, and they feed on producers. These are animals which feed on the things that get the energy from the sun. That's all they feed on. So they are primary consumers. Secondary consumers feed on the primary consumers. They do not eat the plants or the phytoplankton. They eat the animals which feed on the plants. It's very important. Okay, so there's a few words I've thrown in there: animals and plants, and that's on purpose because because animals eat the producers. Yeah. And the tertiary consumers, or the third order consumers, feed on the secondary consumers. So we're basically just moving up here, moving up each level, and these are called trophic levels, and we'll get to that in a second. And fourth order consumers, if you want, they're quaternary consumers, you could say, feed on the tertiary consumers. And finally, we have organisms which are decomposers, and these decomposers break down living thing, so they cause decay of dead organisms, and they recycle the nutrients, so they're available to all other forms, but especially producers. So they cycle the nutrients back down to the bottom of the food chain. So here is an example of how that works. You start at the producers at the bottom, they make the energy then travels up the food chain, and the decomposers finally bring that back down to the producers. Now this is a little bit of an error in this sheet because decomposers can break down any organism. Decomposers break down trees, like you've probably seen fungus growing off a log on the ground, like a dead tree. But you've also know that if any animal dies, whether it's a primary consumer, whether it's a cow, or whether it's a human, or whether any animal dies, it decomposes and it is returned to the soil. So here's an example of a food web as well. And you can see the producers at the bottom. And then on the next level, you can see the primary consumers with the honey eater and the wombat and the kangaroos. And then above that, you can see the animals which eat those other animals. Okay, so you can see the frillneck lizard is eating the crickets, and the echidna is eating the termites, and the magpie is also eating the termites there. So they're your secondary consumers. And then in this image, we have tertiary consumers as well, like the dingo eating the echidna, or the kookaburra eating the lizard, for example.